Hello and welcome back to the Christian Scriptures class. Today we will talk about the two letters to the Corinthians. As you can see, I'm taking you to New York City today. And that's because Corinth really was a hustling and bustling and busy city, just like New York City is today when you compare that to the ancient world. It was a great city with Gentiles and Jews and people from Rome and people from everywhere in the world coming together. You see on the map here, for example, how close it was to Athens. Corinth was on the Peloponnese, that little island that is south of the mainland of Greece, but it was connected with a little bit of land in between. Here is a picture of the ancient city of Corinth, probably just around AD 100. So this is how Corinth was looking maybe about 50 years after Paul was active there. So probably not that much different. You will see that there is something called like the bema in the middle of the marketplace here. That's the judgment place. There's a story in Corinthians where he's being dragged, where Paul and others are being dragged in front of the judges. That was here at the bema, as you can see it. But if you're looking at this picture, you can still see that today. Here there are excavations of the ancient city, the ancient ruins. You see that in the middle there are still some columns there. Maybe go back. You see that it's probably either the temple of Octavia or it may be the temple of Apollo right here. I'm not quite sure which one it is, but you can still see those ancient ruins right there. Here you can see those pillars even more. What was also important was that in the city there was an altar to Isis. No, not the Muslim Isis, right? The Greek goddess Isis, which was a very important goddess in Greek religions, but played a great, big, important role also in Corinth at the time of Paul. You can see how beautiful it was, right situated on the Mediterranean Sea, the blue water back there, it's beautiful. Even looking up a little bit further up on the mountain, there was this fortress that looked over the city of Corinth. And here you can see an image from the ancient excavations over to the basilica. That's an ancient old church. In some ways you can say that that's the continuation of the ancient congregation in Corinth that was founded by the Apostle Paul. It's kind of nice to see that church still there, almost 2,000 years later, right? Now, one interesting thing, and that kind of explains to us why Corinth was such a busy place. You can see that it is right in close to that little piece of land that connects the mainland of Greece with the Peloponnese. That piece of land, as you can see it here, would have been the perfect place to connect the two oceans. Let's go back to that picture for a moment. You can see that if you couldn't cross that piece of land here by ship, you would have to go all the way around the Peloponnese in order to travel. Now today that wouldn't be a big deal, right? Our big ships today have no problem coming around there, but back then when you had those smaller boats, it was so much more convenient if you could come from the Adriatic Sea and then come into that piece of land between Greece and the Peloponnese, and then come around past Corinth and you could come into the Aegean Sea. That would be so much better, right? Well, of course, today you can see that there is a canal through that piece of land. And this is what you can see today, the canal that was cut right into that land. Look how deep that is actually there to look down. Even pretty good sized ships can even go through that today, although it's a little bit narrow. This looks almost scary, how that ship there goes through it, right? But in ancient times, obviously they weren't able to cut through that massive rock there. But they had another interesting thing. So here they had on the beach, you see all these ships coming up on the beach. They would come up there, and then they had built an ancient elevator. They had tracks that were on rollers, and you had lots and lots of people, mostly slaves probably at the time, that would pull up the ships on top of those carts, and then they would pull them on this interesting pathway across that land that was connecting there. Here you can see a little bit of the ancient road still. That was that ship elevator, or that ship path where they were bringing ships from one side to the other. And here again a picture of the ancient part of that. Now, all of that, of course, would make Corinth a place where lots and lots of people from different paths of life would come together. You can see already, looking back at this picture here, that you had a lot of low-class people, right? Or slaves even. People that had to work for very little money and had to do some heavy physical labor to carry these ships across. But you also had lots of industry that was helping that. You had people that needed to fix those ships, right? You had carpenters that were able to fix ships if they needed to. You had people that made sails, right? This is where Paul comes in. He made tents and sails for these ships. If they had broken sails, Paul could replace them. And besides all the manufacturing that was around the ships and other things, you also had traders, of course, right? People that traded goods. Not only was this a place where goods were coming across that little piece of land, but they were trading right in the town. That's why you have those marketplaces also there, right? And right in one of those marketplaces, under the columns around the temple of Octavia, you had the merchants, and that's where Paul probably set up his business when he got there. So here you see Paul's second missionary journey. After he had been here in Galatia, right, to found the congregations in Galatia, he had made a second trip from Antioch, all the way visiting back the congregations in Derbe and in Lystra and Iconium, and then the other Antioch that was in Galatia. He went over to Troas. We hear that story in Acts 16, right? We actually have a lot of stories where Acts collaborates with the stories that we know from 1 Corinthians. So Acts helps us a lot to verify the story. He went across to Philippi and then come back through Thessalonica. He came up to Athens, and then he ended up in Corinth. Now in Corinth, he was getting together with two people that he kind of heard about already from the congregations in Rome. So Aquila and Priscilla, as we hear in Acts 18 verse 2, they were among a group of Jewish people that were expelled from Rome, all the way from Rome, by Emperor Claudius. So Aquila and Priscilla arrived pretty much at the same time in Corinth as Paul did. And not only did he already hear from them, about them from the congregation in Rome, but they were also tent makers. And so Paul and Aquila and Priscilla got together to do business and set up a shop in Corinth. Now, Timothy and Silas, two other co-workers from Paul, they had also been in Macedonia, and they came and joined Paul in Corinth at that same time. Now, as they had established their business, Paul also went into the synagogue, the local synagogue, on the Sabbath, and he was beginning to preach about Jesus. That caused some trouble within the Jewish congregation there. They didn't like that preaching, and so because it caused this trouble, they tried to get rid of Paul. And so Paul just went away from the synagogue and moved right next door into the house of Titus Justus. And they continued to have the preaching there. And you can imagine, now you have a lot of people from the synagogue that are joining Paul to go right next door to Justus's house, to Titus Justus's house. And not only did a whole bunch of people from the synagogue follow him into that house, but you also have the message that Crispus, who was the ruler of the synagogue, so maybe he was like the president of the congregation or so, he was converted. He was baptized by Paul, as we hear in 1 Corinthians. And he came and joined the group next door in Titus Justus's house. And we also have Sosthenes, another ruler or another official of the synagogue, who was also converted and who also joined over next door. So you had part of the leadership of the synagogue joining the new group that was baptized and formed that new Christian congregation right next door. Now you can imagine that that didn't go over with very well, right? The Jewish people, of course, in the synagogue that remained got really upset, and they accused Paul of causing trouble. When I really think about it, I guess he was a troublemaker there, right? He did destroy their community that they had there before with his new preaching. But anyway, so the Jewish people brought him in front of Gallio, the proconsul, and you know the bema that we have in this picture here for a moment? They brought Paul and Sosthenes and other people in front of Gallio, the proconsul, but he finds Paul innocent. He basically says, you know, that's all your religious stuff. You know, I'm here to govern, and I want to keep the peace here, but I don't see any reason or any fault in Paul, so I cannot find him at fault at anything, and basically spoke him innocent. Well, the Jewish people came and they beat up, not Paul, but they beat up Sosthenes, and had a big riot. So we hear that all over in general. In Acts 18:11, it tells us that Paul's work there to establish a congregation took about a year and a half, about 18 months that he was there. And then Paul decided to leave again because he needed to come and visit some other places. So he leaves Corinth for Syria, and this time Aquila and Priscilla, whom he had originally met in Corinth, the tent makers, they're coming with him. Aquila and Priscilla go with him to Ephesus. He crosses over from Corinth over to Ephesus, and Aquila and Priscilla are staying in Ephesus while Paul continues over to Caesarea, and eventually he comes down to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem he ends up back in Antioch, where he was originally coming from. We hear that in Acts 18:19 through 22. But now meantime, while Paul is on his journey to Jerusalem and then to Antioch, a guy by the name of Apollo, who is originally from Alexandria, came up to Ephesus. He apparently was a very charismatic person, a very enthusiastic person. And he was in the congregation in Ephesus at first, and met Aquila and Priscilla there. Now, apparently Apollos had not heard of the baptism into the name of Jesus yet. We get the idea that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and he knew that kind of baptism. And so it says in the book of Acts that Aquila and Priscilla kind of have to introduce him and tell him a little bit more about this new preaching that Paul had been preaching. And so Apollos becomes also converted to full Christianity, not just by the baptism of John the Baptist, but the full Christianity. And then the congregation in Ephesus decides to send him to continue the ministry over in Corinth. And so while Paul is down in Jerusalem and in Antioch, Apollo becomes very active in the congregation in Corinth, so to speak, as their new pastor. Maybe that's how you would compare that today. And a lot of people were enthusiastically following him. Now, with that enthusiasm, one of the things that became very important was the prophesying. And when you get together, that you are in the Spirit and you are full of the Holy Spirit. And the congregation became really very active, very lively. Well, that troubled Paul a little bit, because he kind of thought, on the one hand, that it was great that they're so active, but there were certain issues that occurred with that. People were kind of competing with each other. Who is spiritually more, who is greater spiritually speaking, right? And who is advanced to a higher spiritual level. And so there were divisions in the church. There were some people that started following Apollos, and some people said they followed Cephas, Peter's preaching. Others were talking, so they were dividing each other. And Paul was upset about that, saying this is not what this is all about. We are supposed to be one church, and we are supposed to be there to support one another. And you can see a lot of that coming through in the letter to the 1 Corinthians. I think we talked about that before, that as this congregation is trying to understand what it means to be the Church of God in a new multicultural place, they are encountering all these different issues about how to worship, about what it actually means to be free, right? Paul had preached that the law was not applying anymore, because through the grace of Jesus they were free now. But what kind of freedom does that mean? What does it mean to be free? Does it mean that now you can do anything you want? That it doesn't matter anymore whether and especially there was some problem with sexual immorality. People were kind of looking at freedom a little too much. And so Paul had to address that. And the congregation had asked Paul a lot of questions about how these things should be, and so there were letters back and forth, and so Paul answered some of those questions, right? Now, eventually, Paul decided to come back. He leaves Antioch again, and he goes back through Galatia again. Of course, that's where he always would go, in Phrygia, and he comes to Ephesus. And he sends Timothy and a guy by the name of Erastus ahead of him to Corinth and then also to Macedonia. Now, Erastus is an interesting name. We actually have a historical artifact. Here is an inscription of Erastus that shows that Erastus used to be the treasurer of the city of Corinth. So he was a high political person, a political person of influence, which can tell us a little bit more about this congregation also, right? So you have these very high and influential people like Erastus, and we have Crispus, who was the president of the synagogue and an official Sosthenes of the congregation. So you have all these people of high standing, but you also had a lot of people of lower class. All the people that came, that were ship pushers, right? The slaves that were there, and the simple workers, and also merchants, and they all came together. They were all part of that same congregation. That caused a lot of conflict, right? At one point, Paul addresses the eating the meal together. You see that in the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians, where the people would gather together in homes, and there were the homeowners that were also richer people, of course, and the congregation would go to people's homes, just like they had started out in Titus Justice's house. But he was not the only one who housed or hosted basically the Christian congregation. And when they would get together in their houses to worship and to pray, they would also share meals with each other. And apparently there was a situation where the people that were richer could afford to get there early, and they were starting to eat and enjoy themselves. And then later the people that were poorer came in from work, heavy work and everything else, and everything was gone. Paul didn't think that was a good idea, and especially because all of that the meals were always concluded also with an early version of the Lord's Supper, the Holy Communion. It's called an agape meal, a love meal, right? So where the people were eating, but then they were always remembering that Jesus took the bread, broke it, and gave it to everybody, and that he took the cup and he shared it, and that they celebrated the early versions of Holy Communion. And Paul thought that it should not be something where only some people do that. They should wait until everyone is there and then share Holy Communion. In 1 Corinthians, we hear then, of course, the conclusion of all of those spiritual gifts that were there, that all of that needed to be under the umbrella of love. Number 1 Corinthians 13, the big chapter of love. 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, "If I speak in tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. He continues that until he concludes with that famous saying, "And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." That is kind of Paul's principle that he's giving with anything that you needed to kind of talk about in a practical life, that it needed to be there to love one another. Well, let's go back to our time story, right? After Timothy and Erastus were sent by Paul to go ahead of him first to Corinth and then later back into Macedonia with Thessalonica and so on. Finally, Paul also comes back to Corinth, and he stays there for about 3 months this time. It's probably at that time when he wrote the letter to the Romans, because after he left Corinth that second time, he went back to Ephesus, and then he delivered his the collection that he had made among all the congregations that he had founded. He was about to bring it down to Jerusalem, and that's when he writes Romans, right? We talked about that in the last session, that he was planning to go to Rome afterwards, and to expand his mission to the western part of the Roman Empire. So it's interesting how we can piece together a real life picture of what that early mission was like during Paul's time. We can piece it together both from the book of Acts and of the Corinthian letters here. And now, in order to actually look at all the letters and the structures of them, there are 2 videos here by the Bible Project that are really excellent and give you more of the content of the 2 letters to the Corinthians. And so let's go ahead and watch them.